Motzi Shabbos, Saturday night, begins the fast day of the 17th of Tammuz. It actually does not begin at night. It begins before dawn, actually. And it begins what's called the 3 weeks, or Bein HaMitzarim, the period between the borders, between the limitations, between the two fast days of sorrow. And we refer to it as the 3 weeks, because exactly 3 weeks after the fast of Yud Zayin B'Tammuz is the fast of Tisha B'Av, 9th of Av. So since we will not be meeting before the fast day, we're going to start learning about the 3 weeks tonight in preparation for the fast day. So, and truthfully, for the next month, we're going to be learning about the 3 weeks and about the month of Av and Tisha B'Av, and then we'll get to Tu B'Av. So the next month is really dedicated to understanding this time period that we're about to enter. So the Slonim Rebbe has a beautiful Torah about how to relate to the 3 weeks. And he says like this: 3 weeks, it's actually 22 days. Tisha B'Av will be the 22nd day after the fast day of Yud Zayin B'Tammuz. And of course, 22 is a significant number because it's the number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet, not counting the final letters, but the regular letters are 22. So there is this idea that the 3 weeks is a total cycle in of itself, has a certain energy. Halachically, according to Jewish law, there's a whole world of halacha dealing with the 3 weeks. And the Slonim Rebbe points out that there happens to be another period of 22 days in the Jewish year. And that is from Rosh Hashanah through Simchas Torah. Now here I'm talking about Simchas Torah in Eretz Yisrael, because in Chutz La'aretz you keep a second day. And Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah are actually 2 separate days in a sense. But in Eretz Yisrael, the 22nd day after Rosh Hashanah is Simchas Torah. So here you have 2 22-day periods. And we know from Rosh Hashanah through Simchas Torah is also a world in its own right. And when you're in it, it's like you're in this cocoon of a cycle. So the Slonim Rebbe compares these 2 22-day periods in the following way. He says when a person draws a picture, so first they will draw the outline of the picture, and later they will color it in or ink it in. So he said it's the same about these 2 22-day periods, that from Yud Zayin B'Tammuz through Tisha B'Av, the 3 weeks, he said that's where we begin to make the outline for the coming year. And then when we get to Rosh Hashanah through Simchas Torah is when we color in the outline that we made during the 3 weeks. So this is a very beautiful idea, connecting these 2 cycles. But on the surface, it seems like the energy is very, very different. The energy of the 3 weeks is, well, we're going to be discussing it over the next few weeks, but it's very it's a bit of a down energy. We'll come to understand that because we have 2 fast days and we're contemplating many things that have happened in Jewish history that are not so positive. And we not only remember them, but we feel deeply, to the point that on Tisha B'Av we sit on the ground and we light candles and we say the Book of Lamentations. And Rosh Hashanah through Simchas Torah seems like a very different energy, but what the Slonim Rebbe explains is that according to the depths of our feeling during the 3 weeks, that creates the outline for being able to color it in a more positive way. So this goes along with the idea that is brought down in Chassidut, that there's nothing as whole as a broken heart. And during the 3 weeks, it is appropriate to connect to this idea of a broken heart. For those who were here last week, we discussed this, and we'll get back to it. So I want to read from the Mishnah in Ta'anit. I'll read the translation. The tractate of Ta'anit is about fast days, and in the 4th chapter, the 6th Mishnah, it says the following: 5 things befell our forefathers on the 17th of Tammuz, and 5 on the 9th of Av. Okay, so let's hear what happened on the 17th of Tammuz. Now remember, this is only through the Mishnaic period. We're not talking about the last 2,000 years. This is all from the giving of the Torah through the Mishnaic period, which is about 200 CE. So on the 17th of Tammuz, the luchot, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, were broken. The daily whole offering ceased because the city was surrounded by the Babylonians, and they ran out of offerings to bring in the temple. And on the 17th, it was the last day that they had, they ran out of offerings. And the city was breached, meaning that the enemy broke through the walls of Jerusalem, though it took them 3 weeks to get to the temple. And people who've been in the old city, it's seemingly not that far of a distance from the wall. I mean, the walls in those days were different than today, but still, it was not a huge metropolis. But it took them 3 weeks to get to the temple because they were quite literally fighting house to house, the Jews, to try to protect the temple. So the walls were broken through on the 17th of Tammuz. Postumus, one of the governors, burnt the scrolls of the law. He set them on fire, and an idol was set up in the sanctuary. So all of this happened in Yud Zayin B'Tammuz. Now let's hear what happened on the 9th of Av. So on the 9th of Av, it was decreed against our forefathers that they should not enter into the land of Israel. So this is the day that the spies came back and told the people, we cannot go into the land, they're too strong, we won't make it. And the people cried at their tents and said, let's go back to Egypt, let's pick a new leader, and let's go back to Egypt. So on that day, God decreed that generation or at least the men between ages 20 and 60, would not come into the land, and we wandered for 40 years because of that. That was the first thing that happened on Tisha B'Av. And the first and second temples were destroyed, both on Tisha B'Av. And well, here it's called Beit Tor. So it's Beitar. Here it's called Beit Tor, but we call it Beitar. Beitar was the last holdout of Bar Kokhba during the Bar Kokhba rebellion, approximately 60 years after the destruction of the Second Temple. On that day, Beitar fell. And the city of Jerusalem was plowed up. It was so destroyed, they just plowed it under. And then the Mishnah ends, Misha nichnas Av ma'atim b'simcha. When the month of Av enters, we lessen our joy. So here we get a synopsis of 5 things that happened on Yud Zayin B'Tammuz and 5 things that happened on Tisha B'Av. But we know that, especially Tisha B'Av, over the last 2,000 years, many, many other things have occurred on Tisha B'Av. The most famous one was the expulsion from Spain. The last day that Jews had to be out of Spain or convert was on Tisha B'Av. And we're told that the Abarbanel, who was a great Torah sage, but he was also the king and queen's treasurer. And they were willing to make an exception for him. He was so valuable to the Spanish monarchy. They were ready to give him an exemption, but he decided to go into exile with all the other Jews. And according to many accounts, up to 400,000 people crossed the border on Tisha B'Av, on a fast day. And we're told that the Abarbanel gave permission to play musical instruments as they were leaving Spain, because he felt it was so traumatic and people were so confused and dejected that he felt that we had to do something to bring some joy to the people. So he allowed music. Toby, is it possible that you hold it to the end? Is it possible? Is it possible? Because once we start, then just write it down, okay? And also, many, many different events in World War I and World War II occurred on Tisha B'Av as well. And the Gulf War broke out on the 10th of Av in 1991. So it just, it seems to go on and on. So before we discuss the dynamics and the mechanism of how certain things happen on certain days, I just want to review very, very quickly something that we said last week. And if you were there, it's good to review it. And if not, it's good to hear it before, is that the 17th of Tammuz, 17 equals Tov. And Rav Ginzburg gives over this idea that the good day of Tammuz, the Tov day of Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, was meant to be like the highest day since the creation of the world, because Moshe Rabbeinu was coming down with the tablets of the law, and we were going to begin our march into Eretz Yisrael with Moshe, and we're told that it would have been a different world altogether different world. And then, of course, we had the golden calf, and everything, in a sense, came crashing down. So in the energy of the year, for those who remember, from Pesach up to the Yud Zayin B'Tammuz is just like one straight ascent. And then you get to the 17th of Tammuz, and it was supposed to continue up and up and up and up. And then it's this flat line, like we just, this incredible fall. So Rabbi Nachman teaches, if you believe that you can spoil something, believe that you can fix it. So all of the Rebbes give over the idea that the 3 weeks is not a time to be depressed. It's not a time to be sad. It's not a time to feel pessimistic or feel like giving up. It is a time for deep contemplation of our history and the reasons for the destruction of the temple and the reasons for the exile, but not to the point that we get depressed, and it's impossible to fix anything from depression. But there's nothing as whole as a broken heart. So yes, in a sense, we are encouraged to feel deeply the pain of Jewish history, and really the pain of all mankind, the existential place that the world is in right now. And we're going to see shortly how important it is to feel that. But it's also a time for great rectifications. And that's why we'll mention it now, we'll get into it much deeper. We have a tradition that Mashiach is born on Tisha B'Av. So you would think like, whoa, how does that happen? Tisha B'Av, we're sitting on the floor, we're crying, we're fasting. Why is this the day that Mashiach comes? So this is a little bit what the Slonim Rebbe was saying, is that according to the depths of feeling during the 3 weeks, that's the type of redemption, the type of tshuva that we will feel during the 22-day period during Tishrei, from Rosh Hashanah to Simchas Torah. So it's a time that we can make great rectifications during this time. So I just want to end, because I read the last part of the Mishnahs, Misha Nichnas Av, Ma'atim B'Simcha. When the month of Av comes in, we lessen our joy. But the Lubliner Rebbe, who lived about 200 years ago, great Hasidic Rebbe from Lublin. So he read it actually more literal than the way we usually translate it. He read it, when the month of Av comes in, we lessen with joy. Meaning exactly what I've been trying to express, that it's true, halakhically, we don't eat meat, we don't drink wine, there are no weddings, bathing is curtailed, swimming, live music, all these things. And yet the Lubliner was saying that there's still a way to do this with some semblance of joy. So we will discuss this more because we have almost a whole month until Tisha B'Av. So actually, I'm going to jump to a different part than I originally had thought. And this idea is expressed in a saying from the sages. And actually, before I say it, Sarah just sent a chat reminding me that today is the 12th of Tammuz, and this was the birthday of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe's father-in-law and Rebbe. And the 13th of Tammuz, which we're about to enter into, is the day that the Frierdiker Rebbe was freed from jail. He had a death sentence hanging over him. Many people did not know if they would ever see him again. And bordering on miraculously, he was let out of jail, and then he was allowed to leave Russia, which also in those days was just like, they just didn't do that. But so in Chabad, this is a day of great actually celebration. As I mentioned, the Rebbe's Rebbe was the Frierdiker Rebbe. And so much of what the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught was coming from his father-in-law, who was his great inspiration. And he was totally loyal to his father-in-law. So now to go back, the sages teach the following, that the secrets of the Torah are not given over to one who is not worried in his or her heart. I'll say that again, that the secrets of the Torah are not taught or transmitted from on high to a person who's not worried in their heart. So what does that mean? We don't usually look at worry as a very positive thing. Okay, so we're not talking about worrying about parnasa or worrying about anything worldly. What it means is that only a person who's greatly concerned with the state of the world is a fitting vessel for the secrets of the Torah. So this is a very important idea. And so now I'm going to bring a very, very famous Talmud. Many of you might know this, or at least some of the general ideas. It's an amazing, amazing Torah. I'll try to tell it quickly. So it says that Moshe, during the 40 days, he was on Mount Sinai. So when he was, as it were, up in heaven with God, he sees God putting crowns on the letters. Some of the Hebrew letters have these little spokes, little, they're called tagin, and they're called crowns. And Moshe asked, what are you doing? And God said, in the future, there will be a person who will interpret piles and piles of halakha, of Jewish laws, according to these crowns and the letters. So Moshe was like amazed. He said, could I see this person? So God said, turn around. So Moshe turns around and he finds himself in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. He's sitting in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. So the Talmud says that he actually didn't understand what Rabbi Akiva was talking about. It was on such a high level, he couldn't even understand it. And at the end, Rabbi Akiva said, this Torah is a Torah from Moshe Sinai. So Moshe felt a bit better. And he goes back to God and he says, why didn't you give the Torah through him? And God said, Shtok, kach ala b'machshava. Be quiet. That's the way it is. So I'll just interject that Rabbi Nachman reads it, again, more literally than the way we usually translate it. Shtok means to be quiet. Kach ala b'machshava. When you're quiet, then you could rise up in thought. That's the literal translation. Kach ala b'machshava. So he was, on one hand, he was saying, be quiet. This is how I've determined it. On the other hand is if you will deeply contemplate this, perhaps you will come to understand why I chose you and not Rabbi Akiva. So then Moshe says, well, can I see his reward for being such an incredible teacher? So God says, turn around. Moshe turns around and he finds himself in the place where Rabbi Akiva is being tortured to death for teaching Torah publicly, which was a crime. And Moshe says, Zu Torah v'zu schara. This is Torah, and this is its reward. And God says, Shtok, kach ala b'machshava. Be quiet. That's how I've determined it. So this, of course, is a very profound Torah. And there are many, many different levels here. But the reason I'm telling you the story is Moshe asked a good question. Why didn't you give the Torah to Rabbi Akiva, through Rabbi Akiva? So we have to understand that in among Rabbi Akiva's peers, he was considered the great optimist. No matter what happened, he would be able to interpret it for the good. And we can see this because one of Rabbi Akiva's teachers was Nachum Ish Gamzu, who was famous for saying Gamzu Latova. This apparently negative event is also for the good. In other words, ultimately everything is for the good. And we see there are many stories in the Gemara showing how Rabbi Akiva was able to interpret seemingly negative occurrences in a positive light. And I think I've mentioned that a very, very, very popular book in Chabad circles and wider circles now is a book called Positivity Bias. It's a book I think I've even mentioned in previous classes, where it's an entire book telling stories and giving over Torah from the Lubavitcher Rebbe about how he was able to encourage everyone to see the positive in virtually everything. It's a fantastic book. Look it up, get it from a bookstore or Amazon. Positivity Bias. So you would think, like, what could be higher than someone who just understands that everything that God does is for the good? And even when he is being tortured to death, so he prepares himself to say the Shema. And his students say, Rebbe, how do you have the state of mind to say the Shema? You're being tortured to death. And Rabbi Akiva answers, my whole life, I've been waiting to fulfill what it says, that you shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And now that I have the opportunity to do this, shouldn't I fulfill it? Shouldn't I grab it? And according to tradition, he says the Shema, and when he got to the last letter of Echad, his soul left him. So even as he's being tortured to death, Rabbi Akiva is positive. So you can understand Moshe's question. Ribono shel olam, why did you give the Torah through me? And so the answer in short, or a way to answer it, is that Moshe was profoundly worried about the state of the world. He was profoundly concerned about Am Yisrael. And that is why on many occasions, Moshe comes to defend the Jews, even when God says, a number of times, says, I'll get rid of this people. I'll start a new people from you. And this is the same people that wanted to stone Moshe on many occasions. And yet Moshe defended them. And on occasion, he questioned God's sense of judgment, sense of righteousness. And in a somewhat paradoxical way, this is, in God's eyes, this is even a higher level than just accepting that everything is for the good. Now, of course, halavai that we could be on such a level as Rabbi Akiva. We have really no concept of his greatness and the level of consciousness that he achieved. But Moshe Rabbeinu, evil bothered him. The people's sinning bothered him. God's, as it were, threats against the people bothered him. And that's why he was a fitting vessel to bring down the Torah. This is a great lesson for all of us also. Now, obviously, we also need to be like Rabbi Akiva. And we need to be like the Lubavitcher Rebbe and have a positivity bias and try to see the good in everything. But at the same time, we need to be profoundly concerned with Am Yisrael, concerned for our families, our children, our parents, our communities, our neighbors, not to the point that we become frozen or paranoid or sad or depressed. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So I'm going to repeat something that we learned last week because it can't be repeated enough. And that's what it says in the Zohar, that b'chia tekia b'liba b'sitra da v'chedva tekia b'liba b'sitra da. That one part of my heart is crying and one part of my heart is laughing. And as we learned that there's one level where I know when to be happy and I can express that happiness, and I know when to express my sadness. That's a great spiritual level. But we learned that even deeper is this idea, listen, we only have one heart. So it's simultaneous. You can't like split the heart in half. So the idea is that I have to be in great joy all of the time and in a state of great, we'll call it worry, concern, even brokenness all of the time. So this has a lot to do with the 3 weeks that we're entering into. That when we go over Jewish history and we see what we've been through and we contemplate the reasons for it and hopefully what we can do about it in the present. It says in the Gemara, anyone who lives in a generation when the temple is not being rebuilt. It's like they're living in the generation when it's being destroyed. As much as it's important to cry over the temples that were destroyed, it's much more important to try to pave the way to the rebuilding of the temple. That's the real spiritual work that has to be done. So I think we'll end here, and I'll end with a bracha that all of us can learn how to balance the being joyful and seeing the good in the world and acknowledging it and really feeling that this is a good world. People are good. There's so much to be hopeful for. And at the same time, to be profoundly concerned with what's going on in the world and to play our part, even if it's a small part, in trying to bring rectification, healing, and light to the world.